Highbridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents American Heritage History of the Confident Years, 1866 to 1914, by Francis Russell. Read by Mike Chamberlain. Chapter 1. Trial of a President. The floor of the crimson and gilt Senate chamber filled quickly as the senators and representatives took their places to hear Congressman Ben Butler of Massachusetts present the case against President Andrew Johnson. 25 days earlier, on March 5, 1868, the president's trial had formally opened with Chief Justice Salmon P. Chase presiding over the 53 senators who sat as a court of impeachment. 192 members of the House of Representatives, having already voted to impeach Johnson for high crimes and misdemeanors in office, were present as accusers. On March 3rd, the representatives had adopted 11 articles of impeachment, the most notorious, Article X, having been written by Butler himself. In it, he had accused Johnson of bringing Congress into disgrace by inflammatory and scandalous harangues, and of degrading his office to the great scandal of all good citizens. That ailing but most savagely vindictive radical Republican leader, Thaddeus Stevens, had taken the occasion to warn the president, "Unfortunate, unhappy man, behold your doom." The trial of the President of the United States and the attempt to remove him from office filled Washington with crowds of inaugural proportions. Diplomats and ministers of foreign countries, in all the formal glitter of their gold-trimmed uniforms, newsmen, and favored politicians, jammed the Senate's galleries. The capital's most fashionable women, along with the less elegantly dressed wives of congressmen, occupied the ladies' gallery. A Harper's Weekly correspondent described Ben Butler, ringmaster of the Radicals, as a man whose large, pudgy body seemed literally bursting out of his extraordinary swallowtail coat, exposing a broad expanse of not too immaculate linen, and whose massive bald head, with its little fringe of oily curls, was probably familiar to every occupant of the galleries, for Benjamin F. Butler had not hidden his light under a bushel. There was power in the man's coarse, big-featured face, force and aggressiveness in every line. But his curiously ill-mated eyes, with their half-closed lids, his hard mouth, and small, drooping mustache, all combined to create an uncomfortable impression of cunning and insincerity. He was, indeed, an extraordinary man, self-made, a Democrat turned radical Republican, one of the ablest lawyers, perhaps the ablest criminal lawyer in the United States, and one of the most inept of the Civil War's political generals. In 1864, as a prominent Unionist Democrat, he had been offered the vice presidential place on Lincoln's National Union ticket, although Lincoln privately considered him as full of poison gas as a dead dog. As military governor of conquered New Orleans, he had achieved the nickname Beast Butler by his general order that any female showing contempt for an officer or soldier of the United States should be treated as a woman of the town plying her avocation. He had even been accused of taking away a coffin filled with stolen silver spoons on his leaving New Orleans. Spoons Butler, the Southerners called him, as well as Beast, and in the next decade, they applied his puffy features to the bottoms of chamber pots in the cabins of Mississippi's side-wheelers. His soldiers and his political enemies called him Old Cockeye. In preparing his opening argument, Butler had slept only 9 hours in the previous 3 days. Yet, for all his allegations, he and everyone else present knew that Johnson's crime was that he had opposed the will of the dominant radical Republicans. They, in turn, had designed the Tenure of Office Act of March 1867, an unconstitutional measure, which provided that the president could not remove any civil officer or a member of his cabinet without the advice and consent of the Senate. Earlier attempts at impeachment had failed. But when Johnson suspended his patently disloyal Secretary of War, Edwin M. Stanton, and Stanton refused to leave office, the president's congressional enemies seized the opportunity to bring forward impeachment proceedings. Johnson was denounced on the floor of the House as an ungrateful, despicable, besotted, traitorous man, an accidental president, an American Nero. His career marked by a degree of perfidy and treachery and turpitude unheard of in the history of the rulers of a free people. Butler had a gift for extemporized invective and a voice like a bullwhip. Yet this time he read from a carefully prepared text. And since he was not a good reader, much of his native dynamic power was lost. Wearing evening clothes and a white tie, although it was afternoon, he went through the articles of impeachment one by one. The president, he said, had removed his Secretary of War contrary to an act of Congress. Even though the act was passed over his veto, he and all others must execute the law, whether in fact constitutional or not. He failed to do so at his peril, but that peril is impeachment. As Butler continued his charges, the galleries grew restless, the senators torpid. Only at the end of his 3-hour speech did they come to life again with his perorating invective. This man, he told them, by murder most foul, succeeded to the presidency, and is the elect of an assassin to that high office, and not of the people. We are about to remove him from the office he has disgraced by the sure, safe, and constitutional means of impeachment. Johnson had followed a turbulent, descending road from that high moment of April 15, 1865, when Chief Justice Chase had sworn him in as the 17th President of the United States, and then, extending his hand, had declared, "You are President. May God support, guide, and bless you in your administration." The upward road had also been notable, for Johnson, like his predecessor, had been born into obscurity. The son of a tavern handyman in Raleigh, North Carolina, the boy Andy never attended school a day in his life. When he was 3, his father died, and his mother supported him and his older brother William by weaving and taking in washing. At 14, he was apprenticed to a tailor for the traditional 7 years, but after 2 years, he ran away. For a time, he plied his trade in South Carolina and then made his way across the Smokies to Tennessee. After working some months in Rutledge, Tennessee, he set up his own tailoring shop at Greenville. There, in May 1827, at the age of 18, he married Eliza McCardle, the daughter of a Scottish shoemaker, an attractive young woman who had supported herself since her father's death. The record is now confused as to her vocation. At the time of his marriage, he could read after a fashion, but it was Eliza who taught him to write and cipher. The young couple lived in a single room behind the plank-sided tailor shop on Greenville's Main Street. Andy was a skilled workman, and he worked hard. The tailoring business prospered. Before many years, he was hiring his own apprentices and bought a fine new shop. But his mind expanded beyond his confining trade. He joined 2 debating societies, one at Greenville College, and once a week walked 4 miles to the college to attend its meetings. He now read voraciously, as if he were making up for lost time. Finally, he started his own Saturday night debating club in his shop. At 21, he ran for the town council and was elected. 2 years later, the best people of Greenville were surprised to find the tailor Johnson their mayor. By the time he was 27, campaigning as the candidate of the common people, he had beaten the Greenville candidate of wealth and position for state legislator. Defeated in the following election, Johnson succeeded subsequently in being re-elected. Andrew Jackson was his proclaimed idol, and in Greene County, Johnson seemed to many a local model of Old Hickory. The tailor-turned-politician became a compelling public speaker, with a ringing voice that carried even in the open air. In 1841, he was elected to the state Senate, and 2 years later ran for Congress in a strong Whig district, carrying the day for his own emphatic brand of Jacksonian democracy. As a congressman, he found the social world of Washington of little concern or interest, and spent his free time in the Library of Congress. He became a clamorous advocate of homestead legislation, of giving the nation's western holdings without cost to the mudsills, the landless white settlers, as free land for free labor. 10 years he spent in the House of Representatives, creditably, if not with outstanding distinction, until the Whigs gained control of Tennessee and redistricted the state to gerrymander him out of his seat. But the Whig politicians were not as clever as they had thought, for Johnson, on returning home, ran for governor and managed to defeat his Whig opponent. As governor, he was concerned much more with state than national affairs, showing himself particularly interested in expanding aid to education. As a follower of Old Hickory's, he continued to find in the common man the source of his political strength. Know-Nothings unsuccessfully opposed his re-election. At the end of his second term, in 1856, the by-then Democratic legislature elected him to the United States Senate. In Washington, the patricians and would-be patricians of the South looked down on the tailor-made senator from Tennessee, and he, in turn, nursed his resentments against aristocrats. Jefferson Davis later accused him of the pride of having no pride. As senator, he reintroduced his homestead bill, seeing it through both houses of Congress, only to have it vetoed by the Southern-minded Buchanan. Paradoxically, Johnson, who, to the applause of the North and West, advocated giving land to settlers, was himself a small slaveholder. But he, Old Hickory's shoot, continued to move further and further away from his alignment with the leaders of the slave states. After the Democratic split of 1860, which made Lincoln's election inevitable, Johnson, out of what he felt was party loyalty, supported the Southern Democratic ticket of Breckinridge and Lane. But after Lincoln's election, while the Stars and Stripes was being hauled down in the South as the slave states prepared to secede, Johnson came to the support of the president-elect. "I voted against him," he said in a Senate speech as the crisis deepened. "I spoke against him. I spent my money to defeat him. But still, I love my country. I love the Constitution. I intend to insist upon its guarantees." And he begged every man who called himself a patriot to rally around the altar of our common country, that the Constitution shall be saved and the Union preserved. Such a speech by a Southern Democrat gained thousands of Southerners for the Union, and made Johnson one of the most popular men in the North, although secessionists in Tennessee burned him in effigy. Throughout the eastern part of his state, he defended the Union successfully, but was overwhelmed by the secessionists elsewhere, who were directed by their governor in Nashville. In danger of assassination, Johnson was finally forced to leave Tennessee for Washington, a senator without a state. Through the following winter, the exiled senator begged the president in vain to aid loyal Union men in East Tennessee. Then, in 1862, General Grant's capture of Forts Henry and Donelson forced the Confederates to abandon Nashville and the central section of the state. In an attempt to restore Unionist control there, Lincoln sent Johnson to the state capital as military governor of Tennessee, with the rank of brigadier general. Nashville, still controlled by pugnacious secessionists, received him as a vile wretch, this traitor to the state, and threatened him with tar and feathers, and even death. At first, the new governor tried to conciliate his opponents in office, but the Nashville municipal authorities remained belligerently Southern, refusing to take the oath to the Union and continuing their expressions of contempt. Faced with such recalcitrance, Johnson removed all those of dubious allegiance from office, replacing them with unconditionally loyal Union men. By September 1862, the military governor's own position grew shaky following the sweep of Braxton Bragg's Confederate forces into Tennessee. The timid Union general Don Carlos Buell prepared to abandon Nashville. Only Johnson's dogged determination during a siege of 2 months kept the state capital from falling. Not until January 1864 was federal occupation of Tennessee considered complete enough for establishing a civil government. Johnson then called for an election in March, with the condition that each voter must swear to support the Constitution as a true and faithful citizen of the United States, who ardently desires the suppression of the present insurrections and rebellions. Conservative Unionists were indignant at having their loyalty questioned. Secessionist sympathizers were all for taking the oath and disregarding it. In the midst of the turmoil, Johnson received word that Lincoln was considering him as a vice presidential candidate, a Unionist Democrat who would balance the National Union ticket in the November election, which Lincoln felt far from sure of winning. Unionism, in the end, carried the day in Nashville, if not throughout the state, and huge crowds, invigorated by brass bands, serenaded Johnson at his nomination. "I am a Democrat in the strictest meaning of the term," the old Jacksonian told his cheering supporters. "I am for putting down the rebellion, because it is a war against democracy." Slavery, the old slave owner announced, was dead, killed by those who had wished to save it. Speaking from the steps of the state capitol in Nashville just before the election, he said, "I, Andrew Johnson, do hereby proclaim freedom, full, broad, and unconditional, to every man in Tennessee. This damnable aristocracy should be pulled down. No longer should the wives and daughters of the colored men of Tennessee be dragged into a concubinage compared to which polygamy was a virtue." In spite of the incursions of Hood's army and Forrest's cavalry into Tennessee, most of the polling places were able to open, and Lincoln and Johnson carried the state. Lincoln, though elected by only a 400,000 majority out of a total of 4,010,000 votes, carried 19 of the 22 eligible states. The solid, erect figure of the vice president-elect, though of medium height, gave the impression of strength and power. In young manhood, his sensitive face, with its dark, luminous eyes, had seemed almost wistful. In middle age, his eyes retained their intensity, but his face had grown harder, the chin more combative. The mouth now turned down at the corners, and the brows were knit in a slight but permanent frown. A raw, drizzling inauguration day, found Johnson still recovering from an attack of typhoid fever. That March day turned out to be the most unfortunate and humiliating one of his life. In the vice president's room at the Capitol, he complained that he felt very weak and enervated and asked for whiskey. Vice President Hannibal Hamlin offered a bottle, and Johnson drank a good potation. Then, before going into the Senate chamber, he downed still another stiff drink, telling Hamlin, "I need all the strength for the occasion I can have." By the time he reached the rostrum of the overheated chamber, he was pugnaciously drunk. In the presence of the president, the noble second inaugural address still to be delivered, the cabinet, the justices of the Supreme Court, members of the diplomatic corps, and assembled senators, Johnson harangued at random, as though still smarting from his earlier rebuffs. A plebeian boy, he proclaimed himself, denouncing the fine feathers of the diplomatic corps and all those who put themselves above the people, and, as one reporter present wrote, bellowing and ranting and shaking his fists at judges, cabinet, and diplomats, and making a fool of himself to such a degree that indignation is almost compelled to pity. The dismayed Lincoln stared at the floor. Several senators hid their heads in their hands. Some of those present left. Hamlin edged forward to pull Johnson's coat-tail, whispering, "Stop, Johnson, stop." For days after the incident, Washington was in a ferment. The whole country was shocked, and Johnson's enemies were delighted. "He made a bad slip the other day," Lincoln observed. "But I have known Andy a great many years, and he ain't no drunkard." 7 weeks later, General Lee had surrendered his Confederate forces to General Grant. Lincoln had been murdered, and the tailor from Greenville had succeeded to the presidency. The first modern war, the first fought with the tools and weapons of the industrial age, had left the South in ruins. What at the beginning seemed to Southerners a romantic adventure had in 4 years become a relentless contest of attrition. In Georgia, Virginia, Mississippi, the Carolinas, wherever the armies had passed, the land lay weed-grown and abandoned, marked by gaunt black chimneys, which became known as Sherman's Sentinels. The rich Shenandoah Valley had been systematically laid waste by General Sheridan, who carried out Grant's instructions to ravage the land so completely that a crow, in flying across it, would have to carry his own rations. Railroads, factories, cotton gins, farms, everything of possible use to the enemy had been destroyed. The air itself was rancid with the odor of dead farm animals and smoldering grain. Many of the tree-lined and gracious cities had been burned: Jackson, Charleston, Mobile, Richmond, Atlanta, Savannah. Across the desolate landscape, the pathetic, rootless ex-slaves wandered, sometimes searching for relatives, more often merely moving because they were, at last, free to move. How could the South restore itself? Not through the ex-slaves, their minds as well as their bodies so long in bondage. Not through the aristocrats, who had arrogantly led the South to disaster. Restoration would come, in President Johnson's opinion, through the efforts of the common man, the plain Andy Jackson Democrat who had carried Old Hickory triumphantly to the White House, who had elected Andy Johnson to offices, from mayor of Greenville to senator from Tennessee, over the opposition of the Whig patricians. On becoming president, Johnson the Unionist saw himself as the inheritor of the conciliatory policy of his Republican predecessor. The noble phrases of Lincoln's second inaugural address, with malice toward none, with charity for all, which would become cliches in their heedless repetition, meant, when freshly minted, exactly what Lincoln said. Only a magnanimous peace, Lincoln had felt, could heal the wounds of a fratricidal war. In his opinion, no state had seceded from the Union, because no state could secede. Already in December 1863, the President had offered a general pardon to Southerners willing to lay down their arms and return to their old allegiance. In the same proclamation, he had offered to recognize any state government organized by citizens who had taken an oath of allegiance and whose numbers were at least equal to 10% of the voters of the 1860 election. After his re-election, Lincoln pressed on with his restoration plans. When Congress convened in December 1864, Louisiana became the test state. Some 12,000 of its citizens had reorganized under Lincoln's plan, had taken the prescribed oath, adopted a new constitution, held an election, and installed a loyal government. The new Louisiana legislature had elected 2 United States senators, and these appeared with the state's quota of congressmen at the Capitol. The following February, Senator Lyman Trumbull of Illinois offered a joint resolution to recognize the Louisiana delegation. The resolution would have passed quickly and overwhelmingly but for Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, who, as spokesman of the Radicals in the Senate, objected that under its provisions, blacks would not be allowed to vote. Congress was then little concerned with this issue, which would later loom so large. Sumner's objections were doctrinaire, for though as the hero of the abolitionists he held uncompromisingly to the dogma of black equality, actual black people left him cold and indifferent. Fenced in by his aloof egotism, Sumner had become a walking abstraction. The man who sat in Daniel Webster's old seat in the Senate seemed to have seawater in his veins. "I long since ceased to take any interest in individuals," he once told Julia Ward Howe. Handsome, theatrical, and pedantic, disliked by his colleagues North and South, he saw himself as an eagle soaring high and alone in the sky. Some of his Massachusetts associates considered him insane. When he spoke, he larded his speeches with quotations from 4 languages, yet for all his Harvard learning, his speeches were pompous and second-rate. His bleak complacency could even irritate Grant to a witticism. Once, when someone remarked in the general's presence that Sumner did not believe in the Bible, Grant replied, "Why should he? He didn't write it." Although Trumbull's resolution had Lincoln's backing, Sumner used every parliamentary trick to obstruct its passage, finally resorting to a filibuster to keep it from coming to a vote. As the end of the session neared, vital Army and Navy appropriations bills were being held up by Sumner's obstinacy. Finally, the administration yielded, and the Senate dropped the resolution. Though no one sensed it at the time, Sumner's triumph marked the end of the policy of reconstructing the South through reconciliation. On Lincoln's death, Secretary Stanton informed his cabinet colleagues that they must place their resignations in the new president's hands. But Johnson, directly after he had taken his oath of office, asked Lincoln's whole cabinet to stay with him in this difficult period. To the radical Republicans with their abolitionist roots, Johnson's accession was a relief. They had never trusted Lincoln's pragmatic approach to the South. If the radicals had dared, they would have turned openly against Lincoln. They had worked privately against his nomination, and at one point had
Sample complete. Ready to continue?